A good day to you all. I'm Professor Anil D'Souza, and today I'll be talking to you about Aristotle's Poetics and how it works as a conceptual dramatic framework in the design of organizational culture. Now, as a culture professional, I've been particularly interested in looking at how culture gets developed in an institutional context. And when I first read the Poetics, I was excited about the possibilities it brings to a renewed understanding of culture by providing an aesthetically oriented design framework, so to speak. Yeah, so when one looks at organizations, now most often the culture is developed, by chance. It may be intuitive or organic, or one can have a conscious approach to designing cultural elements which are intellectually and morally sound, providing a sort of a foundational gravitas to the institutional edifice. Now, we all love stories. I think from the time we are little, one of our great joy is listening to stories being read to us or reading them ourselves. We are, in that sense, made up of stories. We contain many stories, and many stories are contained within us. Now, this one is about the art of storytelling, yeah, by an old man named Aristotle, who was born some 2,400 years ago and who loved stories. Now, he was particularly interested in what stories were made of, and he wrote a book about it. The book is no longer with us, unfortunately, but his teaching notes remain, and from these teaching notes, we are able to learn some of the wisdom that Aristotle brings to the art of storytelling. As we begin a little bit about the storyteller himself, Aristotle was born in the year 384 BC, and along with Plato and Socrates, he's one of the three most well-known and popular philosophers from antiquity, Western Greek antiquity at least. Now, he's been a student of Plato's academy. He established his own school of learning, the Lyceum. Now, Aristotle has influenced late antiquity, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance period, as he continues to influence us today as well. The Arabs called him the first teacher. Thomas Aquinas looked at him as the philosopher, and Alighieri Dante called him the master of those who know. Writings, of course, he's written the physics. He's written on metaphysics, the Nicomachean ethics, politics, on the soul, and the poetics, of course, which is what we are going to be talking about today, from what's left of his teaching notes. Now, the Poetics was lost to the Western world for a long time. The text was restored to the West, through a Latin translation of an Arabic version written by Averroes, the Andalusian polymath. This was sometime in the 12th century AD. Now, when we look at Aristotle's Poetic, three elements or aspects to it. There's the tragic element, there's the epic element, and there's comedy. Comedy, which is now lost, nothing really remains of the comedy. What really remains are Aristotle's notes and his ideas on how a good tragic, dramatic work can be constructed. So, what are the plot elements, and how do you put together a compelling tragic narrative, so to speak? Now, some early Greek playwrights. There's Thespis, of course, after whom the word thespian, comes about. And Thespis is, called the inventor of tragedy. He was the first one to act out the character rather than narrate a story. Thespis would travel across cities with his theatrical paraphernalia of masks, other properties, and act out his performances. Aeschylus, of course, the father of tragedy, written quite a few works. Orestia, Prometheus Bound, are a couple of them. Sophocles, the tragedian, or Aristotle, refers to Oedipus Rex as a seminal, tragic work, so to speak. Sophocles also wrote Antigone, Electra, and many other plays. We have Euripides, the tragedian, who has written works like Medea, Orestes. Iphigenia and Aulis is another of his works that Aristotle, refers to in his Poetics. And then we've got Aristophanes, the one who wrote comedies. One comedy of his called The Cloud is something that Socrates refers to in his Apology, or rather Plato refers to Socrates referring to this in his Apology, where Aristophanes has lampooned Socrates and his art of teaching or rather, corrupting the youth. And Socrates also considers to be the cloud, this theatrical piece, to be one more nail in his coffin. Yeah, when he was being tried for corrupting the youth. Some early Indian playwrights. There's Bhasa, and I think probably the earliest Indian playwright. His Urubanga is a very interesting play, and Urubanga, or Breaking of the Thighs, is narrative about Duryodhan's fight with Bhim, his epic battle in the Mahabharata. And we've got Ashwaghosa, who's the Buddhist philosopher and dramatist who wrote a seminal treatise on Gautam Buddha, the life and times of Gautam Buddha. We've got Kalidasa, of course, and Shakuntala is very famous across the world, and which tells the story of Shakuntala and Dushyanta, and of course their son Bharata, after whom our great country is named. Now, what exactly is a tragedy? This is how Aristotle defines it in his Poetics. And so tragedy is an imitation of an action. Yeah, so it's not an imitation of an individual or anything else. It's an imitation of an action that is admirable, that is complete, in the sense there is a beginning, there is a middle, there is an end, there is a sense of unity in the storytelling, and something that has a certain magnitude. Yeah, in language which is pleasurable, and where each element is distinctly a part of the entire narrative, and one which is performed by actors, not merely through narration, and affecting pity and fear, through which a sort of a purification or a catharsis of these emotions happen for the spectator or the audience. So when we talk about some of the elements over here, primarily pity and fear, more in terms of how the action is being played out and how the resolution comes about, bringing about a closure for the spectator or the audience. Yeah? And when Aristotle talks about pleasure, he mentions specifically that one should not seek every pleasure from the poetic work or the tragic work, so to speak, but rather one which is characteristic of it. For example, the tragedy of Oedipus had a fatalistic premise, and hence the events derived evoke a feeling of awe in terms of how the narrative has been artfully developed. Hence, by doing this, the plot stays truthful to this aspect of tragic elements. So all beings, all human beings desire knowledge. And here Aristotle makes a distinction between, of course, human beings and animals. Animals largely go by instinct. Yeah, but we humans like to ask difficult questions and find pleasure in the pursuit of knowledge and learning. Now, this creative principle, which provides us with the impetus to find meaning in our being alive and make every experience a beautiful one, and we find joy in doing so. So this creative principle is what Aristotle calls the techne, or the productive capacity informed by an understanding of its intrinsic rationale. Yeah. So techne as in skill in craft or an avant-garde sensibility, which is a foundational element in designing a good narrative. So here we have the arc of dramatic tension, in terms of how the tension rises and how it falls and how a resolution is brought about. And so this essentially is the German playwright Freyta experiment. It's a very popular representation over here. And of course he draws heavily from how Aristotle talks about the art of creating a dramatic arc. Yeah, so we have an exposition, of course, we have the key inciting incident. We see how the action rises, it reaches a certain inflection point, comes to its climax, and then you have the action which kind of closes, and where a resolution or a denouement really happens. Yeah. So if, for example, we were to take, there's this song by Elvis Presley, "Are You Lonesome Tonight?" And it's sort of sung and narrated, so there's a lyrical aspect to it as well, and with melody. There's "Are you lonesome tonight? Do you miss me tonight?" And someone said that the world's a stage and each one must play a part. Now fate had me playing in love with you as my sweetheart. So act 1 was when we met. You read your lines so cleverly and never missed a cue. Then came act 2. You seemed to change. You acted strange. Why, I'll never know. Yeah, honey, you lied when you said you loved me, and so on and so forth. And then he ends by saying, "Now the stage is bare, and I'm standing here with emptiness all around. And if you won't come back to me, then they can bring the curtain down." So here, I find this particular song a very interesting way of, and it represents, everything that is there in this dramatic arc. Now, let's take for example, story. So there's this king, yeah, and he's a good king who rules over a large kingdom, and everyone seems to be happy in the kingdom. And so one day you have the king who is riding through the forest, comes across a lake, and he happens to see a beautiful damsel, on a boat there, and he's smitten by her. He's besotted, and he wants to marry this girl. So he speaks to her. She asks him to speak to her father. He visits her father and says, "Sir, the father is a chieftain in a village, and says, 'Sir, I'd like to marry your daughter.'" And the chieftain says, "Oh, that is fine. I know you're a virtuous king," and so on and so forth. But it's important for me that my daughter's children, through you, become the inheritors of your kingdom, and their line become kings. And now the king is, of course, very unhappy hearing that, because he has a son, and it was a good son, and that son is the one who would inherit the kingdom. So the king goes back to his palace, looking quite unhappy. Son meets him there and says, "Dad, what's wrong?" And dad says, "Look, this is the situation. I love this woman, and this is the condition." So the son says, not to worry. He goes, meets the chieftain, and he makes a promise. He says, "I'm never going to marry. I'm never going to have any children, and this is my promise to you, and it will be your daughter's children through my father who will inherit the kingdom going forward." So the chieftain agrees. Both the king and the king is happy in a sense. Marries this woman, and everyone's happy over here. Now, without getting into the morality of the king's actions, or maybe we will. There is a certain behavior which can be admirable, and one may say that the son has demonstrated that kind of behavior, and then you have the king who, for his lust or his passion for a woman, makes him act in a certain way. But this, of course, takes us through the dramatic arc, so to speak, as we narrate this particular story. And we look a little more at Oedipus Rex, which Aristotle speaks about when he is giving an example of a great tragic work. There's also Angur, which is a lovely story. It's a story that is based on Shakespeare's The Comedy of Errors. And there's Golmaal as well, the old I think 1980s movie Golmaal, that stars Amol Palekar. That also has a fantastically dramatic arc. That's a comedy, of course. So is Angur. Oedipus makes out a case for a great tragic work, so to speak. I think the story of this king, which I narrated, also which comes from the great epic, Indian epic, the Mahabharata, also carries significant tragic elements over here. And just a few of these examples while we are speaking about how the arc of dramatic tension and resolution gets developed. So when we talk about a plot which is complete, we are saying where the events are essentially connected. Yeah, there is meaning in terms of how the narrative has been built. Yeah, there is one is applying one's reasons, as well when one is connecting the emotional aspects of how the narrative has been really defined and structured. Yeah, and the events are in a sense self-contained as well, and they are distinct in terms of each of the elements of the plot, so to speak, and there is a continuity in terms of how it has been developed. And in the end, of course, there has to be a closure or a resolution or a denouement, as we mentioned a little earlier. So take for example, the story of the dead cat. Anil has a cat, and Soumya has a cat. Yeah, and Anil kills Soumya's cat, and Soumya kills Anil's cat. Now, this doesn't really make much of a story. It doesn't really have any sense to it, really speaking, and one needs to try and figure out what exactly is the narrator talking about. Nothing seems to be connected, and and one is not able to make sense of this. So how do you kind of build a certain premise which then gives meaning to this particular story? So Anil and Soumya are friends, and they both have cats. And one day Soumya's cat goes and scratches Anil's cat, and Anil, in a fit of anger, because some serious anger, I'm sure, he goes and he kills Soumya's cat. And Soumya, who's very upset about this and gets to know that Anil has killed her cat, goes and kills Anil's cat, so to speak. Yeah, so not a great story, but nevertheless, the story, there are some connections that one can make over here. There are events which are, in a sense, distinct and self-contained, and there is sort of a closure over here to this particular story. And yet we'll look at a few more stories which have a certain magnitude, because I think this little story over here, though it may be complete in some sense, there definitely is no magnitude to this story. Some stories, of course, which Aristotle speaks about, one very dominantly is Oedipus Rex. Yeah, so I would urge you to read that story separately. It'll give you a good sense of how Aristotle explains his concepts and his ideas of a great dramatic work by using Oedipus Rex as an example of a great piece of drama. So in terms of how its plot has been developed and how the various elements come together. Another great movie that comes to my mind is Amar Akbar Anthony. Over here, just like in Oedipus Rex, though of course Amar Akbar Anthony is not a tragedy, it's more an action comedy. These are complex plots. Yeah, so it's important for us to keep in mind that Aristotle appreciates a complex complex plot far more than, of course, very obviously, the simple plot. And two ideas that Aristotle speaks about in terms of what gives magnitude to a complex plot are recognition and reversal. So anagnosis or peripeteia, in terms of the Greek words used over there. So recognition is a change from ignorance to knowledge, which marks out the change in good or bad fortune. So for example, in Oedipus Rex, when he begins to realize that he's the one who's murdered his father, and he's married his mother and had children with her. So that is a recognition which happens. If you look at Amar Akbar Anthony, there are many instances where, for example, one when the father Kishan Lal, who's now become a criminal, encounters his son who's a police officer in his old home, and the son digs up a gun which he had hidden when he was a little boy in the presence of his father. There is a recognition over there, and father recognizes the son, and so that brings about a twist, or the narrative moves towards a certain reversal. So for Aristotle, recognition works best when it happens in conjunction with a reversal in fortune. From a tragic story standpoint, an important element here is the existence of suffering, which gives rise to sorrow and destruction, and which is eminent in the recognition and reversal that unfolds in the narrative. And any such reversal that develops into the narrative gives, of course, rise to astonishment in the audience as well, provided such reversal is not contrived, and one which takes place as a natural element of the storyline, because there is a reason for it, which is built into the story. Yeah? Hence, this sort of a recognition and reversal are not arbitrary. It's not like a sudden intervention by a god who comes in because the plot really can't seem to find a resolution, and this is the only way to kind of take the story forward. Yeah. So astonishment and connection are both desirable if the emotional impact of the plot is to be maximized. Another movie that comes to my mind is one of my favorites, which is The Shawshank Redemption. And here is, Warden Norton. And this is when Andy Dufresne, the main protagonist, has escaped through this tunnel. And the tunnel is, of course, there is a picture of the actress Rita Hayworth over there. And of course, when it's discovered that this is how Andy Dufresne has escaped, it sort of takes the narrative to it speeds up the narrative, which is otherwise a slow burn, till this particular point in time. And for Warden Norton, this is a moment of recognition and a reversal in his own fortunes, so to speak, when he comes to realize that how Andy Dufresne has changed the entire narrative in terms of how he would have liked to imagine and see it play out. And some other stories that come to my mind are also Mahashweta Devi's Draupadi. Yeah. So there is the traditional story in the Mahabharata, of course, where Draupadi is being disrobed, and of course the hand of God comes into play and makes sure that she cannot be disrobed because the garment is a never-ending one. Yeah, but in Mahashweta Devi's Draupadi, dignity and courage is changed, because she changes the way this modern day Draupadi responds to being humiliated, mutilated, and molested. And hence there is a strong sense of astonishment which happens to the reader of this story as well, in terms of how the story concludes with a recognition and a reversal in the emotional quality of or understanding of oppression, and how this Draupadi, this modern day Draupadi, rises above her oppression. Another story, of course, is Waiting for Godot, which is definitely not Aristotelian in terms of its plot, because it's a story, it's a plot without a plot. But that's another play that I would urge you to read as well, to understand how Samuel Beckett has crafted this very, very interesting and intriguing, absurd drama. So we saw, how the action, unfolds. We looked at the plot structure in terms of, how it introduces the narrative, how it takes it to a crescendo, reaches a climax, there is a fall, and how this evokes the elements of pity and fear, and takes and gives the audience, sort of a resolution through the process of healing or purgation of these emotions of pity and fear as it comes to its conclusion. So when one looks at the best kind of plots or tragic plots over here, one looks at how does the action move forward? What is the direction of change? Yeah, what is the moral status of the characters involved? Yeah, so there are virtuous characters, there are wicked characters as well, and how does it really work? Yeah, so when we have a virtuous character who moves from good fortune to bad fortune, it can be a pretty unsettling experience. Yeah, what's terrible is when a wicked person moves from good fortune to continues good fortune, or bad fortune to good fortune. It can evoke a sense of disgust, really. And Aristotle says, let's not look at too highly virtuous people. Let's look at ordinary people, regular people, and that's what Oedipus Rex is. He's just another ordinary man, in a sense, slayed by his circumstances. Yeah. So here we have a situation where a man goes through bad fortune, and that can evoke a sense of pity and fear amongst the spectators, the audience who are watching. Yeah, and yeah. So for Aristotle, fear and pity are important, especially when they are evoked through the right objects at the right time and for the right reasons. Yeah. Just as Plato disregarded emotions as an inferior aspect of man's personality, and which need to be suppressed, for Aristotle, emotions were exceptionally important, and they bring in a sophistication to the narrative and the reasoning or the intellectual dimension as well. Though Plato would argue that man needs to rise above his baser emotions through the power of reasoning, something that Marcus Aurelius would also attest to, and something that he talks about in his meditations as far as the ruling faculty sort of works. So when one looks at the idea of hamartia, or the error or mistake of fact, so to speak, and here when one looks at the story of Oedipus, and the road that he takes to avoid his destiny actually becomes the road which actually leads him to his destiny, and some things that he does without knowing that he's doing the wrong things, yeah, and doesn't know that it's going to lead him towards killing his murdering his father, and marrying his mother, and these are terrible things that happen, that evoke to the spectator a sense of pity and fear as he kind of as the spectator goes through the narrative. And but it is these elements of pity and fear that leads the audience towards a cathartic or a healing experience as the narrative moves to its closure. Yeah. So hamartia, or a mistake of fact, has no real moral content, and it is simply an error that the character makes. Yeah, hamartia then will include errors made in ignorance or through misjudgments, just as it happened with Oedipus. But in addition, it may also include moral errors of a kind which may not imply any orientation to wickedness, but yet these are errors, yeah, that have happened, unknowingly, unconsciously, and but they may bring about a catastrophe. Yeah. So though it may hamartia may not have any moral content in itself, yeah, it may lead to situations, with and where terrible things, happen. Now, when we look at catharsis or the healing aspect, catharsis is very fleetingly mentioned in the Poetics, and though a little more of it is mentioned in the Politics. For Aristotle, the relief that catharsis brings is pleasurable, since it evokes in the spectator's stream of consciousness the signature elements of a tragic resolution which they have come to witness through the culmination of the action that is taking place. Yeah. So catharsis is peculiar to plot structures rendered through the effects of pity and fear. A healing effect is engendered through which the spectator relives the action that leads the character to his or her tragic circumstances. Yeah, the catharsis so effected reminds the audience of the universal laws which govern the human condition, and how these have been particularly affected through the narrative. And these remind the audience of the frailty of being human. And through that, there is a healing or a purgation that happens. So when you look at how the elements are ranked, Aristotle prizes the plot as the most essential element when building a compelling narrative, followed by the other elements over here. That's your character, your reasoning, your diction, song, spectacle, the visual effects as well, which you will see in the next slide. When we talk about the visual appeal, yeah, and as the art of drama has kind of evolved, from being in its rudimentary form to reaching a level of sophistication that Aristotle talks about and believes that drama should aspire to. Something that becomes important is how the visual elements of the spectacle has been really built in. And over here, if you look at this this painting by René Magritte, this is coffins in the balcony, or the balcony as the painting is known by. Now, I find this a very fascinating painting. Like you may find other paintings which are equally fascinating and have a certain magnitude or depth, to in terms of how they are painted on canvas. There is a certain visual appeal to them, and they tell you a story. Yeah, so you can keep looking at this painting, and the story suddenly starts, coming alive, and it starts getting developed even as you were to look at the coffins in terms of how they are arrayed out there, how they are aligned, and what exactly they signify. So when we say plot, we are talking about something that possesses unity, as we mentioned, in terms of how the events have been organized and structured, complete with magnitude. How the plot unfolds, how the action rises, how it falls, the movement from good to bad fortune, from bad to good fortune as well, And when we talk about character, we are seeing, what are the moral and intellectual dimensions determining action. Uh, yeah, so a person's character and reasoning, we say that their actions are of a certain kind. Yeah, the actions are of a certain nature, and character is hence manifested on account of the actions taken. Yeah, and when we say reasoning, here of course we are talking about the intellectual, emotional, and the moral dimensions that dictate the choices made by the character. Yeah, why does the character act in this particular manner? What are his motives? What makes him do what he does? What does he expect from these actions? And what do these actions really result in? What happens when Oedipus goes away from his adopted country, not knowing that he's actually returning closer to what fate has decreed for him, so to speak. So in trying to avoid his fate, he meets his fate in the road that he takes to avoid it, as the expression goes. When we talk about diction, we are seeing the verbal expression, the intonations, the pauses for dramatic effect, the modulations, the stress on syllables. So that's where diction, and how do you bring in, lyrical aspects? Is there a rhythmical, aspect to how the entire representation is done? How language is used. Do you bring in song, bring in a lot of harmony, so to speak. Yeah. Then of course, when we look at the modes of representation, you've got the spectacle, you've got actors. Yeah, not just a story being narrated but a story being performed through various actors or through an actor, mimicking or imitating, different characters. Yeah, and though Aristotle, of course, didn't really have a great, view on spectacle. Yeah, which is the sensory representation of production values, the various stage properties, the sense of visual splendor and show that comes about in the representation. Though the visual elements become important, and you see that in a lot of grand performances, so to speak. Yeah. And for Aristotle, of course, drama must, mainly from the standpoint of the spectator or the audience, it must create new knowledge. Yeah, and it is best when this happens through the sophistication of an aesthetically developed narrative and its visual appeal. So when Aristotle talks about metaphor, he does regard this as one of the most critical features of the poetical language, so to speak, and which is the ability to perceive similarities, and which to him can be a natural gift and cannot really be taught. To me, the story, the myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus comes to my mind, where the story of King Sisyphus is used by Aristotle as a metaphor to examine existentialism and what can give meaning to man's existence, what can keep him alive, and what can really keep him or her going. So as we conclude, we kind of move a little away from Aristotle's Poetics. When we are looking at how this great work of art impacts or can be used as a reference model for designing organizational culture. We look at Erving Goffman, the influential sociologist. We look at Kenneth Burke, the essayist and playwright, and who kind of used their understanding of the dramatic form to come up with their ideas of dramaturgy and dramatism. Yeah, in terms of how people, just as on stage, in their everyday lives, manage their settings, in terms of how they present themselves, the words that they use, their non-verbal actions, to mainly give a particular impression to others. So, which Goffman calls impression management. Yeah, so his book, The Presentation of the Self in Everyday Life, makes for an interesting reading to understand how he explains dramaturgy. Yeah, or a person's efforts to create specific impressions in the minds of others. So for Goffman, man's actions were like drama. For Kenneth Burke, man's actions were drama. So in a sense, everything that we do from the moment we wake up, we are preparing ourselves to kind of create favorable impressions, to manipulate the environment such that we appear in favorable circumstances as best as possible. And that's what the endeavor, day in and day out, is all about. And how does he use theatrical ideas to kind of illustrate his point. So we look at the poetics in terms of how does it provide a sort of a design framework, a set of method, a set of tools and design elements when one is crafting an enterprise culture, so to speak. So when one were to look at the foundational ethos of an enterprise today, one clearly looks at it as the mimesis or the imitation, or the likeness of the founder. Yeah, the enterprise finally represents the founder and is in a sense her mirror image. Yeah, the founder develops the enterprise purpose. The founder creates the enterprise's operating values, mainly in her own likeness in terms of the values or the ethos that she brings to the table. Yeah. The development of this likeness is the creative element through which the first seeds of enterprise culture are sown. Yeah, and the pleasure, which is derived through the value that it creates for its various stakeholders, in a sense, emanates from how this imitation is carried about, and how do we do what we do. How does the enterprise, bring itself to life? How does it sustain itself? And hence what are those principles on the basis of which its enterprise culture has been designed. That's what this paper essentially speaks about. And I would invite you to kind of have a look at the paper to look at how I've explained this further. Thank you so much for watching and listening. This is Anil D'Souza signing off.